Okay, let's open in a word of prayer. Goodness, excuse me 1 second here. Forgive me for what I'm thinking about Microsoft at the moment. Let's open a word of prayer. Lord, we come to you today. We pray that you will bless our time together. We pray that you always help us to remember that our obligation in life as Christians is to act in such a manner that it glorifies you. We pray that you always help us to keep that in mind and bless our time together today. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay, so today I'm going to try, my slide's a little messed up, misinformation, try misinformation. There's a lot of different things going on. There's some of the places where we don't always post all these places, but we're in the process of developing an app and some other alternatives specific to our church. I'm not sure how long that rollout's going to take, probably longer than we expect or hope, but we're trying to do that. We talk about these convergence of events, and it's very interesting. I do watch some other prophecy updates, and that's one of the terms that I see a lot of people using is convergence. And if you remember, I talked at that Canadian conference back in April, Last Days Bible Conference. I think it's probably still on YouTube. Deplatforming humanity. And I used sort of a grid that I gave. It's ACLU, acceleration, A, C, convergence, L, logistics, and U, understanding. And the logistics is simply, and I've used for example, one of the views, I'm going to say one of the views, it's not a view I can entirely discount, but it's not a view I entirely accept, is Babylon. So please, if I mention a view, it doesn't mean that I'm teaching you that particular view. I'm teaching what some of the views are that are out there. And every time I mention a view, somebody says, well, no, Babylon is Rome. No, Babylon is Jerusalem. No, Babylon is America. So, Just remember that. So, but the one view that some people hold very strongly, how's that? Not me, but others, is that Babylon will be rebuilt in Iraq. And my point is that will take time to do. It will not happen overnight unless it's a virtual thing. I suppose that could be true given the way virtual reality is going. But there's a logistics aspect to it. So, for example, when we talk about an Ezekiel 38-39 war and invasion of Israel with a great company and a mighty army, you have to see that army in place. And armies massive, great companies and mighty armies, which I think is being described there, don't end up in Syria and Lebanon overnight. It takes time to assemble them. When the U.S. invaded Iraq, it took 6 months, and that was with an enemy that they were going to defeat in a few days across a desert, not mountains. It took 6 months to get everybody there to launch that invasion. So that's just the practical reality. I suppose things might happen more quickly now, and now we're in the area of asymmetric warfare as well, too. I'll talk a little bit about that today. So we have these slides that I use regularly. So let's look at some of the things that are going on. Actually, at the end, I hope, if I have time, I will get to some of the recent archaeological discoveries that confirm the presence of Israel in the land of Israel that are denied by many in the world, including the leader of the king of the country next door, who continually acts like Israel never had any presence there. So let's look at some of the things. We'll look at cultural things first. I'm going to look at some things that are specific to America, but I think you can take those things, the concerns that I have or the direction that I see things going, and sort of tie it in together with the way things are going in a lot of other countries. I will admit, when I watch it, I'm very troubled because the speed with which this stuff has come on the world, particularly America, and of course that's where I live, so that's what I can follow most closely. but it would apply to Canada. It would apply to the UK, France, Australia. I mean, other countries are going through these things. I also want to clarify one thing. I have talked about growing demographics in different parts of the world, that the area that's set to explode demographically, that if the Lord's return is delayed, Africa is just going to explode in population. And I wanted to be clear to someone who asked it, I don't care if Africa explodes in population. I'm just telling you what the demographic facts are. And the mix of Africa right now will lead to massive immigration and changes elsewhere where demographics are collapsing. I don't have anything, and I'm not saying they shouldn't immigrate legally, and so I don't have a problem with Africa growing. There are some countries that are largely Christian in Africa, but there's huge political problems. We know what Boko Haram is doing in Nigeria to Christians. We know what Islamic Jihad is doing in other places of the Sahara Arab countries. We know that there's tremendous political instability. Ethiopia is falling apart. Ethiopia and Egypt and Sudan look like they're on the verge of war over this dam in Ethiopia. It's a very difficult world, and I'm most familiar with, I had very good friends who were missionaries in the Central African Republic, and at one point in time, you can go dig out the maps, the Central African Republic was considered the most heavily evangelized and Christianized nation on the planet. It was a country of about 4 million people in Central Africa, about half of which lived in the area of Bangui, the capital. But that country has been in massive political crisis for a decade or more now. People I know that were missionaries there for decades have had to leave and return to the United States or go elsewhere because the country is just not safe. And that was a country that was the most heavily Christianized one in the world. And I think it's indicative of the fact that we live in heavily, the wars and rumors of wars and the instability should be readily apparent, even in countries that had a huge Christian presence. Part of what happened in some parts of Africa that were heavily Christianized is the church never got rid of animism and some of those sort of the pagan religions. And then there was a lot of corruption in the leadership. Like that doesn't happen in the United States. We're completely free of that, right? No. Before I get to this story, I don't even have a slide for it. Brian Houston at Hillsong, Australia, in Sydney, has been charged with covering up, at least the reports I've read, I haven't been able to dig into it in depth, that he has been or will be charged with covering up sexual abuse by his father. His father passed away many years ago, I think 2006. But there were people that were really hurt by Hillsong. And we know that there's been huge moral problems, both from a sexual and money standpoint with some of the Hillsong satellites here in the United States. So I do not know how long or if the Hillsong movement will survive this latest thing. There's also a big trial coming up that will involve financial corruption at the Vatican. It's pretty serious. One commentator I read today said that the success of Pope Francis' papacy will rise or fall on the outcome of this trial. Now, I think the guy has not been. It depends how you define success. If you define success as submitting to Islam and destroying whatever remnant of true faith would have been left, and bringing pagans in to do ceremonies on the Vatican grounds, and Muslim imams to come in and pray on the Vatican grounds, then he's been a roaring success. But this is, you see these things happening. You see with Hillsong, you see with the Catholic Church, you see with some of the mega movements or denominations in this country. This is indicative of the times in which we live. These things are going to deteriorate. You're going to see in the church, you're going to see, I see some evangelical churches, large evangelical churches that I've even been to on a couple of occasions, in just total meltdown over bringing in critical race theory type, applying critical race theory, woke, racism, anti-racism, Marxism, and it's tearing churches apart. This is all indicative of the end of the age. We should expect these things. So here's an article from today's London Times, a commentary, Trans Purity Test has lost touch with reality. I find it interesting that there are secular people, the lady who wrote the Harry Potter series, which I think is an abomination personally. She made billions. I mean, literally, she became a billionaire writing those books. She has been very critical of the transgender movement in England and the radical nature of it and how it is redefining basic science, that you are born male or female. And to the radicals, as this article points out, they don't care. They don't care about that. They want to tear it all down. That could be another theme of today's talk, is that people are just trying to tear down everything that's related to Christianity. Now, here's an interesting statistic. Now, I have mixed emotions about this one. This is from Axios, and it says, houses of worship have been left out of the construction boom. Listen to the first part of this article. Construction spending on religious facilities touched a record low annualized rate of $3 billion in June. This is a 66% decline from its $8.8 billion record high in August 2003, according to census data. So religious church building construction, that would be like a synagogue, a church, a mosque, has fallen 66% since 2003. That's a pretty significant decline. I think it reflects the fact that a lot of people do not consider faith of any kind to be part of their mix of beliefs. Now, we could say, well, they were spending way too much money back in 2003, and there's some validity to that. We've all seen the mega churches that get built up around. I don't see as many these days because of the coronavirus thing that's been going on, but still there are big churches being built. There were some here locally that were ready to open $8, $9, $10 million facilities just as all the lockdowns started in March of 2020 with this coronavirus. So that has some impact on it, but you can see from the graph that it hasn't been that really super significant in the last couple of years. It happened more maybe tied to the 2008 financial crisis. There was a significant drop. But certainly, I think it's indicative of the fact that religious influence, by and large, is waning. Now, one person has said that maybe the explanation for this is that churches do more online. And so people are getting online and finding a church and doing their fellowship that way. That could be true. We saw a lot of growth in our online subscribers over the past few years. I have some problems with that because I do think that Hebrews chapter 10, verse 25, that says, forsake not the assembling of yourselves together, especially, it says, especially as you see the day approaching. I think that still applies. But, so there's a whole range of things that you could say cause this, but the significant thing is, I think, it clearly is tied to the fact that people just don't consider, if we just specify Christian church, good, solid, Bible-believing churches, those churches in some respects are declining in many places. because people just think, well, I'll just believe whatever I feel like believing this week. We're very postmodern in their approach. I should probably dig it out. It was like, I think it was 20 years ago this week, I gave a talk on postmodernism at a conference, Bible conference in California, lamenting the fact that postmodernism was going to really have a bad impact on the church, as I've observed things really even in the last few weeks. Postmodernism has invaded the evangelical church. And when I say evangelical, I mean good, solid evangelical, not the, what do we call them, the evangelifish aspect, or that talk I gave in Vancouver about 4 years ago. The title of it was, and some of my friends who are vegans got upset with it. I called them the vegangelicals, no milk and no meat. Now, I thought it was kind of clever, but some friends who were vegans were very offended by that. You can't please all the people all the time, I guess. Well, so this is indicative. So now that's too much time on 2 slides. Let's go through these a little more quickly. This is a phenomenon all over the world. There are fires in Greece. There are some pictures of them. People had to evacuate the one island near Olympus, where they started the Olympics. This is a picture of that area. This is the stadium in Mount Olympus, and I think the Olympics end today anyway. They also had massive fires in Turkey, major damage. There are reports today in some of the Arab press. You have to understand that there's tremendous tension between various parts of the Muslim world. You have the Arabs, which are largely Sunni, but you also have the Turks, which are largely Sunni. They're in a very strong competition. The Saudis, for example, do not forget the fact that the Ottomans controlled Mecca and Medina for hundreds of years. They also don't forget that the Hashemite kingdom of Jordan, the king Abdullah II, does not forget that his family used to control the Holy Mosque and were kicked out by the Saudis. So there's competition and tension between these various aspects of Sunni Islam. And then we have Shia Islam, Iran, large portions of Syria, Lebanon, Iraq, Bahrain, even though Bahrain is ruled by a Sunni leader. There's just tremendous tension within the Arab world. So they have a tendency, if you want to know what they think about Turkey, go read the United Arab Emirates press. And if there's something negative about Turkey, they'll put it in their paper. And Turkey will do the same about the United Arab Emirates. Turkey will attack Israel or the Abraham Accords to get at the United Arab Emirates and the Saudis. So this is just this back and forth. And so you have to kind of sift through all this to determine what the truth is. But the truth is that in the case of the fires in Turkey, Turkey was totally unprepared. They had not budgeted anything for fires. It took them by surprise. At least they had not planned for it. So here we have Greece. We have this. This is from the United Arab Emirates, a picture of the fire that took place in California. That was very devastating. Here is another. This is from a Greek paper about some of the fires that are taking place. This seems to be a worldwide phenomenon right now. This is happening a lot of different places. My response to this to somebody who would say, well, it's nothing, or this is very troubling, my response would be, what did we really think the end times were going to look like? I mean, we read all these things in the prophets and Revelation and Matthew and Luke and Mark, and I think we just sort of think that, well, these are just not going to happen. but they are, and they seem to be getting set up to happen worse and worse. At the same time, though, what you also see is a explanation to take God totally out of the picture. And this is the global warming thing. Now, I think the world may be getting warmer. I'm all for it. I live in central Ohio. I'm not a fan of winter. As I told people, if I have to stand in line to get a tea time in January, I would consider that a good thing, ultimately. There is a new report coming out tomorrow. This is reported in the London Times and a number of papers today. World is warming faster than we feared, warns the UN and the International Panel on Climate Change. Now, this is the report that they issued a year or two ago. The new report will be released tomorrow. This one is like 700 pages long. It's got great graphics, but understand this is an agenda, and this one will really be, from all that I've been reading about it, including in today's Times of London, this one is going to be really apocalyptic in its nature. Part of this is designed to take over and control everything in the world. I've showed you the reports where people say that, you need to have, 4 pounds of meat per year? If any, I'm willing to take any of yours, your allocation if you want to donate it. But this is, and people are saying, well, you can't live that way. You have to live in cities. You have to live in small apartments. Families have to live in 600 square feet. And so what it is, it becomes an economic control thing, a totalitarian control thing. But it only applies to us. It doesn't apply to Barack Obama and his $12 million home, summer home on Martha's Vineyard, where they put up a tent. And did you see the aerial pictures of this? The Daily Mail does a great job of getting these things. It's bigger than his house, the tent, for the 500 guests. I don't know. They said they scaled back. I don't see how I can't imagine what it would look like if they hadn't scaled back. 500 guests, 200 servants, and that's okay. And I saw pictures of the party. Nobody was wearing a mask. And it was all left-wing Washington elites, almost to a person. Now, that just seems a bit, well, it doesn't seem strange, because, as I said, if hypocrisy was water, Washington, D.C. would drown. So this report, you can look for it tomorrow. At the same time, with the control thing, these are protests in Paris about the health passport that they've instituted there. People are upset. These took place in cities all over France. I found, given some of the things that have been said about President Macron, I thought these were some of the better pictures that came out of the protest. Dictator, and then this one was Macron as King Louis, and the sign there says the restoration of the monarchy. In Italy, passes are needed for a museum or restaurant. Passes are needed in New York City to go to sporting events or restaurants. There are some restaurants locally. What's that? Natalie's, the coal-fired pizza place down at Graceland. I think they have one in Grandview as well. Have said if you can't prove vaccination or a negative COVID test within 48 hours, you can't come in our restaurant. I was talking to some friends who said they go to restaurants. They can't get anybody to work. There's millions and millions of jobs that aren't being filled right now. You sometimes go to a restaurant, even around here, and you will find that half the restaurant is closed off. And you get there, half the restaurant is empty, and they tell you there's an hour wait because they don't have the wait staff. My brother went to a restaurant the other day where he lives, and he said, we'd like takeout. They said, we're not doing takeout tonight. We're just not going to do it. So he went around to the front door and walked in and sat down right away and got served. I mean, I'm not sure I understand that. But there's just this devastation everywhere. Remember, it was 2 weeks to flatten the curve, right? That was, a year, 5 months and 2 weeks ago or so? 4 months and 2 weeks ago? This is an article in the Atlantic. This was written by a former assistant director of Homeland Security in the Obama administration. And she says this is in their ideas section. Unvaccinated people need to bear the burden. Beyond limiting the coronavirus flow from the hotspots to the rest of the country, allowing only vaccinated people on domestic flights will change minds too. Look at some of the things that she says here in this article. At this stage of the pandemic, tougher universal restrictions are not the solution to continuing viral spread. While flying, vaccinated people should no longer carry the burden for unvaccinated people. She concludes in her article that allowing only vaccinated people on domestic flights will change minds too. Her conclusion is that all unvaccinated people should be immediately put on a no-fly list. And she was a powerful person in the Obama administration. And that was before we had what I considered to be the third Obama administration that I refer to as the Biden administration. I would highly recommend that you get this article. It's from And Magazine, A&D Magazine. It is an article by Sam Faddis, Charles Sam Faddis, who is a lawyer, and we love lawyers around here. Well, some of them, the ones that are right. But it's an article about Josh Gertzler, Biden's MAGA hunter. Now, this is the I am troubled by what I see going on. Gertzler is the special assistant in the White House now to, I guess, countering violent extremism. He starts off by saying this: Gertzler is not a household name. He should be. He is Joe Biden's point man for responding or for weaponizing the federal law enforcement and intelligence agencies and using them against Biden's political opponents. At this point, that this is happening cannot be disputed. If you see anybody saying contrary to this, they are lying. I saw, what was the guy's name? Vance. He had also been in the intelligence thing in the Obama administration, debating Ben Shapiro on Bill Maher the other night. Look it up on YouTube. And understand, you're going to hear some words that are bad words. They exist out there. So if you don't want to listen to hear some bad words, then don't turn it on. But they were debating critical race theory. Vance said, oh, this is just all made up. Critical race theory is just a thing from law schools. And Ben says, I studied it in law school. I know exactly what the people wrote. And he says, so Vance goes, well, then you don't want history taught. And Ben says, no, I think I want everything in history taught. I just don't want the concepts behind critical race theory weaponized to create racial division. And Vance said, well, that's not happening. Nobody's doing that. It's not happening anywhere. And so this is what the left is doing, is they're gaslighting us, and they're pushing this through all of the institutions now. It's everywhere. I've even seen it in some Christian colleges and universities. It's not even challenged. So here's what Faddis says. Normally, Geltzer, another retread from the Obama administration, is the special assistant to the president and special advisor to Homeland Security advisor on countering domestic violent extremism. In this role, Geltzer oversaw the creation of the new national strategy on countering domestic violent extremism. This is the absurd document produced by the Biden administration. I even read it now when it says Biden administration. Biden administration, which claimed that white supremacists, i.e. Trump supporters, posed the number one threat to American national security. The obvious purpose of this document was to provide the underpinning for the efforts by all elements of the national security apparatus to act again and oppose again anyone opposing Biden and his policies. Now, if you go over to a blog called Lawfare, they talk about this. This is a blog where they talk about filing lawsuits against people and bleeding them out financially, defending themselves. We used to apply this to Muslim organizations that did the same thing. They engaged in lawfare. They would sue people and eventually bleed. They can't afford to defend themselves. And they don't have to, unless it's really egregious, they don't have to pay the attorney's fees in America. Everybody has to pay their own. But here is the article. I think I referenced this document a month or so ago when it came out. National Strategy for Countering Domestic Terrorism. Now, this is Gertzler's baby. So remember the name, Gertzler. Look him up. Learn about what he believes and what he's doing. Look at what some of these things are. I think this is about a 32-page document. It talks about what we need to do to counter violent extremism, assessment of the domestic violent extremism threat. Listen to this. The intelligence community assesses that domestic violent extremists who are motivated by a range of ideologies and galvanized by recent political and societal events in the United States pose an elevated threat to the homeland in 2021. Enduring DVE, domestic violent extremism, motivations pertaining to biases against minority populations and perceived government overreach will almost certainly continue to drive DVE radicalization and mobilization to violence. Now, I'm going to ask you, show me the events. Show them to me. Give me your evidence, Mr. Gertzler, or shut up and go away because you are a liar. This is not happening. I saw a prayer meeting going on in a park in Portland, Oregon. Go to Andy NGO's Twitter feed. People were praying. They had a speaker there. Antifa people came up, destroyed their speakers, carried them off, bear sprayed the people that were there, including children 4 to 10 years of age. This happened yesterday in the United States of America. And there wasn't a cop in sight to do a thing. And this guy comes and says, oh, it's you Christians or people who supported Donald Trump. I'm going to need to bring a towel up here to wipe my computer off. This is maddening to me. Look, I know it's predicted. I know it's coming. I don't have to like it. And I live in a country where I'm allowed to stand up against it. But this is troubling. Newer socio-political developments. Now, listen, this was published in June. I have told you week after week after week about the countering violent extremism narrative that they have been building so that anyone who disagrees with Jen Zuckerberger and the nonsense that she puts out. Oh, my 5-year-old, she likes wearing a mask to school. We spent some time with one of our great nieces the other night. It's been a while since I had to explain, maybe never explain to a 3-year-old why a square piece of pizza is really the same as a triangular shaped piece of pizza. She wasn't buying it. And I think she would probably say, what do you mean, a mask? Anyway, newer social and political developments such as narratives of fraud in the recent general election, the emboldening impact of the violent breach of the U.S. Capitol, conditions related to the COVID-19 pandemic, and conspiracy theories promoting violence will almost certainly spur some DVEs to engage in violence this year. I would bet, in the Christian sense, bet $1 million that a Josh Gertzler or a Jen Zuckerberger, or well, I was going to say Joe Biden, but I don't think you could analyze the situation that well, that they would look at this and they would think this is violence. There's nobody carrying a gun. The only people firing tear gas were police. You see lockdowns like this happening in Australia, where they have military coming in and helicopters to get people off the beach. Look at what it also said. This is more. The intelligence community assesses that lone offenders are small cells of DVEs adhering to a diverse set of violent extremist ideologies are more likely to carry out violent attacks in the homeland than organizations that allegedly advocate a domestic violent extremism ideology. DVE attackers often radicalize independently by consuming violent extremist material online and mobilize without direction from a violent extremist organization, making detection and disruption difficult. Now, I read a lot of opinions that oppose the current government narratives. I do not see them advocating violence. I'm sure they're out there. But I'm just saying is, I think I have my thumb on the pulse of the mainstream. I don't see it. This is a big lie. Here's another paragraph. The intelligence community assesses that DVEs exploit a variety of popular social media platforms, smaller websites with targeted audiences, and encrypted chat applications to recruit new adherents, plan and rally support for in-person actions, and disseminate materials that contribute to radicalization and to mobilization to violence. I can assure you that the guy who wrote this, a lawyer, Josh Gertzler, and by the way, it's okay to not like some lawyers. He would see that Christian prayer meeting in a public park as a big problem. I'm just telling you, this is the way the narrative is going. The IC assesses that several factors could increase the likelihood of lethality of DVE attacks in 2021 and beyond, including escalating support from persons in the United States or abroad, growing perceptions of government overreach related to legal or policy changes and disruptions. Now listen, by the way, interruption, sidebar, whatever you want to call it, that's a prophecy, or that is a indication of where they're going. You understand? They are going to overreach. They're going to make change in legal or policy changes and disruptions. They're telling you that in advance. And if you resist that, you're a violent extremist if you challenge it. Do we agree on that? You used to have a law professor. I took many hours of tax, which I'd never used, just because I loved this guy. And he would always say, are we in agreement on that? We have to be in agreement on this or we're not moving forward. Sir, are you in agreement with me? And he would go down the row. Very entertaining. But this is true, that this is an important, critical fact. So what they did within how I first found this document was a tweet from the FBI. The FBI did this tweet: family members and peers are often best positioned to witness signs of mobilization to violence. Help prevent homegrown violent extremism. But the link there takes you to this document. Now listen, this is domestic that they're trying to control, countering violent extremism. Remember all the moonshot CVE documents I've been showing you about how to control this, how to get social media involved to shut people down and that sort of thing? But this tweet from the FBI, July 11th, 2021, it takes you to this document, Homegrown Violent Extremist Mobilization Indicators 2019 edition. So I thought, I'll read through this to find out what they're thinking. This is what they were thinking. Heeding the call to violence from foreign terrorist organizations, including the Islamic State of Iraq and Asham and Al-Qaeda and other groups. This is what this document was related to. I agree that that is homegrown domestic violence. That's violent extremism. Especially what ISIS did. Go read the books that have been written about it. Go read Seth Ransman's After ISIS. By the way, it reads like one of the worst horror novels you've ever read in your life. Except it gets worse when you realize that what Seth is reporting is journalism, reporting what was going on in Iraq and Sinjar and the Kurdish areas. Here again, this thing goes. This booklet is focused on individuals or groups that are inspired or enabled by foreign terrorist organizations, including but not limited to ISIS, Al-Qaeda, and their affiliates and allies. So back in July, in conjunction with the release of this report that was written by Josh Gertzler, the FBI tweeted and turned you back to a document that was related to a certain religious violent extremism. But what have they done by doing this? They have made anyone who opposes us that might be religious the equivalent of these people. You see the plane flying into a building there? Here's the graphics from that FBI report from 2019. Who was doing this stuff? That's Al-Awlaki there in the computer. The American cleric who they killed in, I think he was killed in Yemen. He was recruiting this. See this, all this stuff here? People scoping out buildings and that type of thing. So what they're trying to do is they're trying to do this false equivalency between the two. And this is the way that Gertzler and the White House view things. There is a great website. I would highly recommend that you put it in your bookmarks, the Accountability Initiative. I think Sam Faddis, I think Trevor Loudon and others are looking for information that you can gather about people like Josh Gertzler and other people that are influenced by China domestically, like people who might have security clearances that appear to be in the pocket of China. People who have security clearances. And down in the lower right-hand corner, there's Josh Gertzler himself on the Accountability Initiative. In that, one of the things that they link to through this is the open letter to the Biden-Harris administration. We are calling on the Biden-Harris administration. Now, this is not what they think. This is what groups that are trying to push this narrative are thinking. We're calling on the Biden-Harris administration to treat disinformation as an intersectional threat. Do you hear that information now? Disinformation, misinformation. We will tell you what is true or not. And you need to adhere to the common set of facts. But if you quote from certain government health websites, you get banned or blocked from places. It's their own publication. And so what they've done is they've outsourced to the big tech companies the control and flow of information. Our broken information ecosystem, this letter says, with unaccountable tech giants serving as gatekeepers. Now, what's the interpretation of that? We need to get these people in line to do to you what we're not allowed to do because there's a thing called the Constitution. Poisons the public discord and corrodes our capacity for progress. Indeed, now this is written in November of 2020, after the election. Okay? President Obama, what? How about former President Obama? Or how about big estate owning former President Obama? recently identified the lack of a common baseline of facts as the single biggest threat to our democracy. Obama? And facts? Like he ever used those? And this crisis of truth is not merely a long-term problem. It is one of immediate implications for your administration's top priorities and governing agenda. And that claim of Obama came from this article in The Atlantic, Why Obama Fears for Our Democracy. The former president, now finally, somebody calls him the former president. Maybe it should be, this is my personal opinion, okay? The former president, AKA the current shadow president, identifies the greatest threats to the American experiment, explains why he's still hopeful, and opens up about his new book. And I think it was like part one of his autobiography, and it's like, what was it, 800 pages long? He is, by the way, the most self-aware person I have ever met or seen in public life. This letter to the Biden-Harris administration, it will be exceedingly difficult to build consensus and enact the administration's ambitious agenda when the American people are not merely polarized, but living in disparate realities with warring sets of facts. You know what? That's true. I don't believe a thing they say. Now, I told you where a lot of this came from. There was a narrative that developed a long time ago about, this is from the Department of Justice back in 2015. It happened at George Washington University. A man named Carlin, Assistant Attorney General John Carlin, spoke. He talked about the partnership between the Department of Justice and the Southern Poverty Law Center, which was working with the center there at George Washington. And the threat, the Department of Justice's highest priority is combating terrorism, both international and domestic, and other threats to our national security in order to protect the American public. He goes on in one of these things. Oh, look what it says here in the second paragraph. This is 2015. CVE will require community engagement. And as we are learning in the international terrorism context, it will also require countering the message of hate online. So listen, this has been in place this has been ramping up for a long time. We're just seeing the flower blooming now. And it's blooming in high definition. It's unmistakable that people could see it. Here's an editorial from this morning's New York Times. It's been 50 years since America's last real update to its Constitution. I've seen articles from Harvard University Law School saying there are holes in the Constitution, we need to fix those. We need to change that thing. Somebody sent me this morning. I thought this was a very good graphic. If you could zoom out. This is what's happening. Okay, so that's what's going on. This is troubling. This is what's happening. Get used to it. So let's look at the Middle East real quickly. Let's see. Oh, here, well, this is another one I wanted to talk about. Oh, yeah, this happened. There's so much going on, my friends. And I was out of town for a few days this week, so I didn't even have time to read that much. This is an article that was published from, I can't remember, it's at PLOS Biology, Mounting Anti-Science Aggression in the United States. There's a troubling new expansion of anti-science aggression in the United States. It's arising from what? Far-right extremism, including some members of the U.S. Congress and conservative news outlets that target prominent biological scientists fighting the COVID-19 pandemic. Translation, how dare you disagree with us? We have the truth. We're like Jacinda Ardern, the Prime Minister of New Zealand. I will tell you what the truth is. You do not rely on anyone else. You get your information from me and my government. Now, it's been a while since I took high school biology and physics and that sort of thing. But my recollection is that the scientific method was people would propose a hypothesis and then test it. And sometimes it would go completely against the conventional wisdom. Did it not? Isn't that the way that it worked? Didn't they champion Galileo as a great example of this when he said that the universe didn't revolve around the earth? Here's another thing. Facebook. There's a research going on at NYU. What they did was they got people's data from Facebook and were tracking how they were targeted with ads. Facebook deleted their Facebook accounts, the people that were doing this research. Said, you can't use our information like that. Here's a chart from this article about aggression against science. And you see this, U.S. Congress, far-right America first, conservative public individuals, conservative news outlets, aggression against science or U.S. scientists. Wow. Amazing. Here's a little, this is from the Jordanian newspaper. King Abdullah, in the upper right-hand corner, it says, without a well-coordinated international effort, the crisis in Lebanon may extend far beyond its borders. He also he said that the U.S. administration, this is what King Abdullah said, the U.S. administration is committed to the two-state solution. Jordan has absolute support for Jerusalem and its Islamic and Christian holy sites. There he goes again. He's probably on a streak that rivals Joe DiMaggio's 56-game hitting streak with not mentioning the Jewish holy sites in Israel. He never talks about it. The world appreciates the Palestinian and Jordan's role in standing by them. Continuing reform in all political, economic, and administrative fields. The importance of administrative reform as it directly reflects on economic reform in Jordan. The attendees appreciate the king's, he had a big conference. The attendees appreciate the king's firm stances toward the Palestinian people. The Saudi foreign minister was also asked questions about the Abraham Accords by Richard Engel, foreign correspondent for NBC. And here's a little bit about what he had to say. I may fast forward through this just in the interest of time.
In the waning days of the Trump administration, there was this accord, and Arab states, Bahrain and UAE primarily, signed on for peace deals with Israel, and so far seem to be, from what I understand, happy with them. And that accord survived its first stress test. There was a little war this summer with Israel fighting against Hamas in the Gaza Strip, and I wasn't sure if these accords were going to survive that, but they did. So the question is, did Saudi Arabia watch that? Is the kingdom thinking of joining? I know you've said in the past you want a comprehensive deal and wait, but is that the direction you're leaning in?
Look, we've always said that peace is the strategic choice of the Arabs. And I think what we have to do is focus on working towards a comprehensive solution to the Palestinian issue. We think that overall the Abrahamic Accords have worked positively to spurn, I think, engagement in the region. So in that sense, the decision by those countries that engaged can be viewed positively. We think that we need to build on that spirit, and the best way to build on that spirit is to find a path to solving the issue of the Palestinians and finding a path to a Palestinian state, because that will deliver complete normalization for Israel in the region.
So is that your condition, that no Palestinian state, no Palestinian agreement with all the Palestinian factions, Hamas and whoever runs the West Bank, or there will be no normalization with Saudi Arabia? Is that what you're saying?
So I'm not going to go into the details of the negotiations. The Palestinians have one legitimate representative, which is the PLO and the Palestinian Authority, and that engagement is the key engagement in order to progress towards a peaceful solution. I think without solving the Palestinian-Israeli conflict in a sustainable long-term way, we're not going to have real sustainable security in the region. So we need to try everything we can to make that happen.
Do you see any progress coming on that front? I mean, I haven't seen any real progress on the Israeli-Palestinian front in a very long time.
Well, we have a new government in Israel. Perhaps that can deliver some progress. We'll have to wait and see.
Well, yeah, more about that later. Remember, Richard Engel was the one back in, must have been April, May, June of 2011, 10 years ago, was interviewed by Brian Williams on NBC about what was going on with the Arab Spring and the meltdown in the Arab world. And remember, he said, I've played the clip many times, he said, overall, Brian, I think this thing ends in Jerusalem. It's just an interesting thing when secular people get it right. Here's a little video about Beirut. I don't think there's any sound to it. This is the 1-year anniversary this week of the August 4th explosion. Look at some of the things that happened in this. I think I free-phrased the moment that the wave hit one of the buildings here in just a moment. It is, the grain silos still stand. Hardly any of the buildings have been fixed. People are suffering. Reports are 80% of Lebanese now live in poverty, on the order of magnitude of the poverty of Haiti and Cameroon. Oh, there you go. I thought I froze it. But did you see how those buildings blew out? Let me back it up a second here. Look at these these large apartment buildings. Look at the wind. Look how it just blew right through those places, and people are just in severe distress. Health clinics, depression, anxiety. People are fleeing. People who have money are leaving, which further deteriorates the thing. People have power, maybe an hour to 2 hours a day, maybe. Most countries won't let people travel there. Hyperinflation. People that made $1,000, their money now buys $100 worth of what it bought a year ago. They have 10% of the purchasing power. Here's a building. These is a year later. These buildings haven't even been touched. The silos still stand. Protests all the time. This is gas lines that stretch for miles. And then people get there and they find out there's no gas anyway. So Lebanon is in total meltdown. Now in northern Lebanon, we had this situation where this is a rocket fire. This is from Hezbollah media, or Al-Manar. It's Hezbollah media in Lebanon, showing the firing of rockets into Israel. They even have a video game for Hezbollah about it. It's called Holy Defense. So there's this situation along the border with Lebanon and Israel that is causing a bit of problems these days. Protest in Beirut. Here's a big protest along the waterfront near, you can see the silos in the back upper right-hand corner. This is a map. New York Times, they do some great journalism at times when they try to stick to the facts. And you see the silos were located roughly here, I believe, in the middle. And because they really protected a large portion of West Beirut because they absorbed the blast. It didn't move across there like it could. But 300,000 people lost their home in a split second. And virtually none of them have been restored. That's in a country of 8 million people. 1.5 million of whom are Syrian refugees from the Syrian civil war that they can't afford to take care of. And there are probably 500,000 to 1 million Palestinian Arab refugees from 1948 that still live in refugee camps. People are upset with Hezbollah. They're upset with Iran. This is a poster at the protest in Beirut saying Iran out. This is Israel responding with tank fire. Israel also came in and fired rockets, or Israeli jets hit South Lebanon with rockets the first time since 2006. And this week was also the 15th anniversary of what's known as the Second Lebanon War. Here's a picture, some videos. This is the rockets being fired on the right. And then there's they're being shot down by Iron Dome. Clearly, this is a Hezbollah missile launcher on the back of a truck. Now, this came in a Druze area. Druze is, I wouldn't call them Muslim. It's a religious sect. You see them if you go to Majal Shams in northern Israel. That's a Druze area. There's Druze villages just along the border there of Israel-Syria border and Israel-Lebanon border. So here's what happened, though. The Druze were upset. So they went to this guy launching the missiles, and here is what happened when they got him. He looks a bit concerned. This report in the National and the UAE to this morning, discord between Hezbollah and Druze threatens to become violent. But how does this affect Israel, and does this have prophetic significance? This is Anna, and I never know how to say her name. We'll just call her Anna. Anna's article in the Jerusalem Post this morning. Has Hezbollah fired its largest rocket salvo towards Israel in 15 years. It became clear that the border with Lebanon has turned into another front where days of conflict can erupt at any moment. The rocket fire on Friday morning surprised the thousands of Israeli tourists who were enjoying the summer vacation by kayaking on the Jordan River or hiking the dozen of trails through the hills of the Galilee and Golan Heights. The clear blue skies were interrupted by rockets raining down and Iron Dome missile defense intercepting them before they could do any harm. The rocket fire came just days after 3 rockets had been fired by unnamed Palestinian militants. And believe me, they didn't do it unless they had the approval of Hezbollah. Towards the city of Kiryat Shimona in north central Israel, up near Tel Dan, in that region, up near the Lebanon border. It's like a big junction there where a lot of people live and a lot of highways come together. IDF retaliated. Hezbollah, she says, was able to sit back and take the over 100 artillery shells fired by the IDF in response to the rocket fire, the 5th such incident since May. Here's a report from Press TV in Iran, which Iran supports Hezbollah. Here's what they had to say about what happened this week.
The Secretary General of Lebanon's resistance movement, Hezbollah, said that the recent Israeli attack was a very dangerous development, which has not occurred in the last 15 years, stressing that the resistance needed to respond swiftly.
Our response was linked directly to the 2 incidents of Israeli Air Force attacks, which targeted Lebanese territory for the first time in 15 years. And our response had very clear tools and objectives. We calculated our moves very precisely. Our enemy and our friends said this. They said open territory. They did not target civilians. So we also targeted open areas with no civilians. But we had many options. We could hit open areas in Sheba Farms, in northern occupied Palestine, or the occupied Golan Heights.
Said Hassan Nasrallah made the remarks in a televised speech to commemorate the 15th anniversary of the 2006 war. He said that Israel deliberately targeted open areas in the middle of the night in order to terrorize civilians, and presumed that the resistance would not respond because of the various domestic problems inside Lebanon. Said Nasrallah stressed that the main deterrence for Israel is the capabilities of the resistance.
العدو اليوم
The enemy today is more fearful than any time in the past because of the developments in Palestine and the region and the transformations in the region and the ascending strength of the resistance.
So back to Anna's article in Jerusalem Post this morning, but striking the road was what happened in one of the Israeli attacks was they targeted the launchers and they also targeted the road that they drove to get there. And Hezbollah did not like that because Hezbollah relies on these roads for its command and control and resupply efforts. And this is maybe really what have ticked off Hezbollah so that it responded in a limited fashion. Anna says this, many of Hezbollah's capabilities and infrastructure are intertwined with the civilian infrastructure of Lebanon. And though Israel refrained from striking Lebanese infrastructure during the Second Lebanon War, Israeli officials have warned repeatedly that civilian infrastructure is now a legitimate target for Israeli Air Force strikes. What happened days ago was very dangerous and a development that did not happen for 15 years, Nasrallah said. The rocket attack shows Hezbollah's deterrence as it fired at open areas. But that's not how Nasrallah sees it. Nasrallah said this, we are not seeking a war, but we are ready for it and we do not fear it. Neither Israel nor Hezbollah, and definitely not Lebanon, are itching for war at any time. Israel is experiencing a new wave of the coronavirus, and Lebanon is going through the most devastating economic and social collapse. Something that's only been seen, according to international money and economic exports, the collapse in Lebanon's economy has only been seen 2 times in the last 300 years. She says this, the IDF long believed that any outbreak of violence with the Shiite terror army would lead to an all-out war, but a military intelligence assessment released in February said that instead they expected that there could be more limited rounds of violence, like with the Gaza Strip. And I think her assessment is pretty much spot on, that what Hezbollah now is going to try to do, I think, rather than a big war, and Israel has said, you come against us, we're doing, remember I played the clip of the Israeli Air Force guy from a few years ago, we're doing shock and awe like you've never seen. But now I think what Hezbollah is going to do is they're going to do limited strikes for a while, and they're going to, I'll call it the Gazification of the northern border. You know how they always have, and then Israel has to go in, and in Gaza they call it, I think Caroline Glick calls it, mowing the lawn in Gaza. You know, we got to go in and take out some buildings and destroy some things, and then everybody kind of goes back to normal. And this cycle's been going on for 20 years in Gaza. And now the fear of a lot of people is it's going to happen now with Lebanon, and it's just a drain. It's just people don't like it. Hezbollah controls, here's the blue areas or areas that Hezbollah really controls, but they're the most significant force in Lebanon. But they don't control up along the coast, northern coast of Lebanon near Tripoli. They have headquarters in Beirut. They also have southern Lebanon they control. And then also up near the Bekaa Valley on Syria. And they kind of go across the border and they've been helping. They lost about, I think, 2,000 fighters in the Syrian civil war. About 6,000 more were injured. But this is what Hezbollah does. This is a Hezbollah weapons warehouse in southern Lebanon, in Eba, and you see where it's located, 25 meters from a school. I'm going to play a few-minute clip. I have about 15 minutes of clips of him, but we just don't have the time this morning. I would highly recommend that you go to the Begin Center, like Menachem Begin, the Begin Center YouTube channel, and watch the Zoom conference that they had the other day. It's about an hour long with Jonathan Spire. He wrote a book on the Syrian war, probably the most comprehensive one that's been written to date. It may ever be written. It's a phenomenal work called After the Fall. He is, in my estimation, one of the best analysts in the Middle East. He was embedded for months and months and months with different factions and Syrian government military units. He's also been in Iraq, Kurdistan. His knowledge is very broad-based. And I will have to say that I know him through social media, because I'm a close friend or anything. But I will say, PM and I listened to this in the car coming back to Indiana and back home the other day. He is one of the most articulate men I've ever seen or heard, seen and heard. See, I'm not even I can't even just be articulate in describing it. But at first he's going to talk about Lebanon. I'm going to play a little bit of clip of what he says about Syria. He's written 2 articles in the Jerusalem Post over the last month, The Slow Death of Lebanon, and then what's going on in Syria. And is a man who has tremendous understanding and can express it. So first he's asked some questions about Lebanon, and here's what he had to say.
Movements. So the Shia, Aoun's presidency is the result of a kind of alliance between the Shia and an element, a part of the Christian community in Lebanon. And that goes back to a kind of Christian tradition in Lebanon. It goes all the way back to the mid-19th century, in which the Christians always looked for an outside power to work with them. And it was the Egyptians, and then it was the French, and then it was the Americans, and then it was Israel. And Aoun, whose alliance with Hezbollah might look strange if you didn't know that, is following on in that tradition. He's basically accepted that an alliance with Iran is what he thinks will keep the Christians safe from the threat of Sunni political Islam. Well, that's how he put it. More prosaically, perhaps, he's decided his own road to power and success, lay in that alliance, and he's very much with it. So, FPM, Free Patriotic Movement, and Aoun, the Christian element, is only able to exercise such power as it has in alliance with Hezbollah. The bloc of which they're both a part is the largest bloc in the parliament, which means that it naturally would have the largest the role in forming a government. Put that together with the role of Hezbollah or FPM-associated people in the security services, dominating the most important intelligence agencies in the country. Put that together with their role also in economics and the maintenance of a sort of independent economic and social sector for Lebanese Shia, and of course put that together with their unassailable military power. They've just got an army that's bigger and more powerful and stronger than the Lebanese armed forces, and you put all that together and that's what you've got. You've got a system which is the single most powerful element in the country. It doesn't mean that it runs the whole country without opposition, and it doesn't mean that it can just assert its authority everywhere in Lebanon. Hezbollah and the Shia can't do that. They can't and don't dominate Sunni northern Lebanon. They don't dominate the northern Bekaa. They don't dominate the Druze areas in the Shuf, for example, in the country. But what they do dominate is Beirut itself and the area south of Beirut all the way to the border with Israel. And that's what they need to dominate in order to be the single most powerful element in the country. Important to stress that issue, that last point again, though, that they are by far the single most powerful element in Lebanon. That doesn't mean to say that there aren't other elements and power arrangements and presences in the country. There are, and Hezbollah has to some degree to take those into account. But it is exponentially stronger than any one of them, and it is able to force its will through on the issues of greatest importance to it and to its masters in Tehran, of course.
Okay, thank you. I want to move to Syria, although we won't leave Lebanon behind, and I'm going to ask.
Well, let me summarize some of the other things he said about Lebanon. Is that there's this theory among some people in Israeli power structures that they can sort of manage the collapse of Lebanon and come out the other side. And Jonathan Spire thinks that this is just sort of a fanciful notion, that Israel cannot manage this from an intelligence standpoint by embedding people there, and they cannot manage it by just doing airstrikes. Eventually, there has to be a war where there's a victor. This has been Daniel Pipe's criticism of the way Israel has handled the Palestinian issue for nigh unto almost 75 years now, that they never really won the war. They never really, for lack of a better term, beat the enemy into a total, complete submission and admission of defeat. And so now they have these situations where As I mentioned, they have to mow the lawn in Gaza, and they have to smooth things over in Judea and Samaria. They're going to have the same problem in Lebanon if they try to manage it. And I think Jonathan talks about this. And he also goes on, well, I'll talk about his Syria comments in just a moment. And remember, I think I mentioned this last week or week before. This is a new report from the strategic assessment for Israel for the new president about how to handle Lebanon and some of the issues that are facing them. There's the problem with Iran, which influences Syria, influences Lebanon. It says here that Israel needs to prepare for the following scenarios in close collaboration with the United States. And we see these things prophetically. In the event of a return to the JCPOA, strive for substantive influence and a longer and stronger follow-up deal, retaining Israel's freedom of action. In tandem, ensure a credible Israeli military option against Iran and prepare for the scenarios not reaching an agreement, reaching a near threshold situation, even a nuclear breakout. And this is a very difficult situation for Israel. Danny Gantz, the defense minister, this week said that Iran was, in his assessment, 10 weeks away from developing a nuclear weapon. I can show you a report from CSIS, intelligence think tank, from back in 2005 or 2007, talking about what happens in a nuclear exchange between Israel and Iran, and Israel and Syria at the time, because Syria was developing, had a nuclear reactor at the time that was later destroyed, shortly thereafter destroyed. But they talked about what happens if there's a nuclear exchange. By the way, the outcome of that intelligence think tank's war game was Israel survives. Syria and Iran do not. And that's pretty significant because Iran, through many different governments and empire, it's pretty much been a country for thousands of years, maybe longer than any other country on the planet. And it has sort of a national geographic design to it. They have mountains. It's essentially a fortress, very difficult to invade, and you certainly can't destroy it from the air. So Iran, this week, they did an attack on a ship late last week, I guess it was last Sunday maybe, and it was an attack by a drone. This is an article from the Times of London this morning, and the conclusion of the article is there are guards on these ships because of Somali pirates in the area and that type of thing, and other people. The article says guards can't. What are they going to do? Have rocket launchers now on commercial ships? What's this going to do to insurance rates? So the CENTCOM, of which Israel is now a part, came out and they have a big report on who attacked this ship, a owned by an Israeli billionaire, I believe, called the Mercer Street. A couple people were killed, including this guy in the inset, who was one of the guards. He had been involved in a Somalian hijacking many years ago. And they took apart the pieces of the drone, and they found that it is an Israeli drone. Not an Israeli drone, an Iranian drone. It is an Iranian drone. It is an Iranian drone. There's also reports, I think that there was, I don't know if it was an American or another ally drone got shot down again. Remember they shot down one during the Trump administration? There was never really any specific retaliation in the near term for that. I think it was before the United States took out Soleimani in Iraq. But that drone that was shot down then and the drone that was shot down this week, these drones cost between $180 and $230 million each. They can stay aloft for over a day. They can fly up to about 350 miles an hour. It's incredible what they are. But coupling this with, so this drone attack happens, there's reports of a ship being boarded by Iranian Revolutionary Guard people, and this came just before Raisi was sworn in as the new president, the hardliner. I'd also recommend you go listen to Caroline Glick's interview this week when she was in Washington, D.C., at the Center for Security Policy, Frank Gaffney's group, where she interviewed an Iranian expert, and their conclusion was, look, we used to have this fiction that Rouhani and some of his predecessors as president, where they were sort of moderates. I mean, Ahmadinejad, he was a crazy guy. We know he was not a moderate. But others like Rouhani are moderates. Zarif is a moderate. Well, listen, maybe they are not. I think it's insane to think that those guys are moderates because they have to be approved by the regime. But there's no question now that Raisi is a hardliner. There are some thinking that Raisi has been put in power to become the supreme leader of Iran. I think it's more likely that he's been put in power because he knows where literally the thousands of bodies are buried. He helped foment a lot of that, and he will try to get Ayatollah Khomeini's son to become the new supreme leader. Ayatollah Khomeini is in his 80s now. And during his swearing in, you always should look at pictures. And so here's the swearing in. So you see on the left, in the front row, is the chief deputy of Nasrallah from Hezbollah. In the middle there, where the overlay language is, that's Hania, Islamah Hania, the head of Hamas. And the guy in the circle in the back row, that's the chief foreign policy guy that was sent by the European Union. This is how the Iranians work. This was done to show who is most important to them, where their alignments are, and the EU is relegated to the back row, effectively, compared to the people that are. And the other guy there is the guy from on the right, there in the front row, is the guy from Islamic Jihad, Ziad al-Nahala. So, very interesting. I'm going to not play Jonathan Spires' great interview where he talks about Syria, but it's similar to what he talked about Lebanon, that there's a conflict now in Israel. How do we handle Lebanon? Do we try to get rid of Assad? Do we try to make peace with Assad? I think Jonathan is spot on in his analysis, listen, you have Russia there, you have Iran. Russia and Iran have overlapping goals. They conflict in certain areas, but they are not going away. You're not going to get rid of Iran. Iran is too deeply embedded throughout Syria, just like they're embedded through Hezbollah in Lebanon. They're embedded maybe even more deeply through various militia groups in Syria, particularly along the Israeli-Syrian border. They're not going away. The only way that they get destroyed is in some future war. Until then, it will be an operation to try to manage the conflict. But go listen to at the Begin Center and listen to Jonathan's interview. Just a couple more quick things. The Naftali Bennett, and this two-headed thing that they have for prime minister going on, appointed Mike Herzog as the ambassador to the United States. This tweet from somebody on the right in Israel said, "What motivates Prime Minister Bennett, who calls himself right-wing, to appoint the left-wing Mike Herzog, who has been negotiating with the U.S. administration for a complete withdrawal of Israel from the United States? Why is he getting appointed as the new U.S. ambassador?" A senior official mocks the appointment and says this: "The IDF did not want to give Mike Herzog the rank of general because he was gray and mediocre. So Naftali Bennett gave him the position of senior ambassador." People on the right think this is a major embarrassment, and this is an indication, reading the tea leaves, as to where this Israeli government might be heading. And I think this plays very well into various scenarios about Bible prophecy and what they're going to do and trying to make peace with their enemies. Fake peace. Pay attention. Now, the next picture might be very, very disturbing. You know, there is this narrative in the Arab press among the jihadi groups and King Abdullah of Jordan, the Islamic wave that the Jewish settlers routinely stormed the Temple Mount in Jerusalem. So I want you to be prepared for the disturbing nature of what you're going to see of a picture of settlers who are getting ready to visit the Temple Mount this morning, or storm it, as the Islamic authorities claim. I know that this is a very frightening picture. I mean, can you imagine that triple stroller coming at you? This is just satanic. There have been a number of archaeological finds. This is a Second Temple meeting hall near the Temple Mount that has been recently open to the public. There was a wall found that dates to the time of Hezekiah. Hezekiah was the king who expanded Israel to the western hill. That was because people were fleeing from the north to Jerusalem, which, because of its fortifications, because Sennacherib and the Assyrians were coming after them. You can read, I mean, you go to the British Museum and you can see what Sennacherib says about it. He never mentions what happened in Jerusalem, where, was 160,000 got killed by the angel of the Lord. He's sort of like, I went through all the cities of Samaria, and I went to Jerusalem, then I went home. That's sort of what the Sennacherib cylinder says at the British Museum. But this is another wall of Hezekiah. You can see Hezekiah's broad wall there in the old city today. This does not appear to have been destroyed in the Babylonian invasion in 586 BC, probably because it was on a slope. And then here is a pottery that has, I believe this is the name of Jeroboam from the Bible. I told you about this from Israel Hayom. They found these 49 cisterns that are located around the Temple Mount. These were to hold water to be used in the worship at the Temple Mount. These things are, when you look at this picture, I mean, they're all over. There's 49 of them. There's water all over around the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount, not down in the city of David, at the Temple Mount. And again, I can't remember, Scott Stripling and some of the guys from down in Houston, they do a great job of talking about where the Temple Mount was located. And then this, just a report today. Researchers find physical evidence of the earthquake described in the Old Testament. What earthquake? Was dated to the 8th century. It was dated to the time of the prophet Amos. Is it mentioned in the Bible? Well, let's look at what it says in Amos. This is Secular Magazine's reporting this, folks. Smithsonian. The words of Amos, Amos 1:1. Who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. Abdullah. Listen, somebody enterprising here, would you send King Abdullah an express copy of the Smithsonian and also a copy of Amos? You can probably find it in Arabic, although he reads English, so English would be fine. He went to school in England. I think that would be great. And by the way, send one to Rick Wiles at True News, too, while you're at it. I think he might find it useful. Okay, we'll talk about this next week. Here's an article from Israel Hayom. It says this: a weak government will encourage terrorism. That was from a couple weeks ago. This is what the article says in Israel Hayom. Tomorrow, and this is from July 23rd, so 2 weeks ago today, or yesterday. A weak government will encourage terrorism. Tomorrow in the synagogues, we will read in the Torah the continuation of Moshe's farewell speech from the masses of Israelis who gathered to hear his message. Adding that the peoples of the world would be jealous of the wisdom and understanding of the Israelis. But we don't seem to do this. After only a few weeks of the faltering government functioning, I doubted how many of the Israelis are really smart. since an elected government is supported to reflect a kind of collective wisdom. The government does not show the ability to govern and make decisions. Every minister in his office is a small empire. Every Knesset member can squeeze out ministerial and deputy ministers. Islamist parties in which supporters of terrorism hold the government by the throat, on and on. The only defenders of the government are media flatterers who are rightly convinced that this is a government is their exclusive work, a psychedelic artistic performance, and as part of the collective dissonance, they are fiercely supposed to defend their work. The government's failures are not only in dealing with the coronal plague, deepening the rift and polarization, the strange preoccupation with disposable utensils, and the excessive waste of public money to fill the Norwegian fjord and the Knesset. Anyway, he goes, you ought to get an article. You can find the English of this at the Israel Home website. But he says, this is a problem. But he said it's folly because we are weak and we have enemies. And I think this is sort of in line with the Bible prophecy. So look, I'll say what I say most weeks now. Stand firm in the faith. Act like men. And it would be... well, enough said. There's a lot I could say that I just don't feel at liberty to share. But I do a prophecy roundtable with some guys I don't agree with. And we get along, we're friends. We agree wholeheartedly on the main things. And I think we're not perfect and we do this on Thursday nights. Sometimes we get a little bit ticked off at the others, but in all, we're brothers in the Lord. And hopefully we will be able to model a little bit about how we should get along with people that we disagree with. Because, folks, Jesus prophesied that there's going to be a lot of polarization and fighting in society, culture, and the church. There should not be fighting in the church. So, enough said on that. Let's stand firm in the faith and act like men and work together. Let's pray. Father, thank you so much for your word. We pray that you will help us to remember what the important things are. And remember that all we do, we should act in a manner to glorify you, our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ, who saved us, who did not deserve it, by your grace and by the death of your Son on the cross and his resurrection and his return to set things right that we look forward to. Bless us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.